Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the story of Joan of Arc. We've got excerpts from her Wikipedia page, and wow, it is packed with info. Our mission, we're going to cut through all of that and give you a clear picture of Joan of Arc, who she was, what she did, and why she still matters today, centuries later.
It's really amazing how much is out there about her. But yeah, we're going to connect the dots and uncover some fascinating stuff.
Exactly. So first things first, let's set the stage. We got to go back to the early 1400s, right in the middle of the Hundred Years' War. This was not just some small conflict.
Oh, no.
This thing had been going on for generations, and it was absolutely ravaging France.
Just imagine a country torn apart.
Right.
You know, economy in shambles, the English just gaining more and more control. It was a really bleak time to be French.
And that is where our story begins. Not in some fancy palace or castle, but in a tiny village called Domremy. This is where Joan of Arc enters the picture. A peasant girl.
And you have to think about it. Domremy was right on the front lines of this whole conflict. So these villagers, they lived in constant fear. Raids, destruction, losing everything. They wanted peace so badly.
And this is the environment that Joan grew up in, surrounded by war. She was a devout girl tending to her family's farm spinning wool, all while absorbing her mother's deep faith.
That strong faith, paired with that ever-present threat of war, that really shaped her destiny. Because at just 13 years old, Joan starts having these vivid visions of saints.
Not just like quick little glimpses either. She described seeing the Archangel Michael and two female saints, St. Margaret and St. Catherine. They would appear to her often, especially when the church bells rang. And they would give her guidance and even specific instructions.
It's really interesting that these saints that appeared to Joan, they were known for their strength and their defiance against powerful enemies, fighting for what they believe in, even when facing, overwhelming opposition.
Yeah, and then you add to that all these prophecies that were floating around at the time. People were talking about a virgin savior, this maiden who would rise to restore France's glory. So these prophecies, Joan's visions, the desperate situation, you can feel this powerful atmosphere of anticipation.
People were really yearning for a miracle. And Joan, with her unwavering belief in her mission, she seemed to embody that hope. And what's fascinating is she didn't just sit back and wait for things to happen. She took action.
Right. At 16 years old, she sets out on this incredibly bold journey to meet Charles VII, the uncrowned king, or the Dauphin, as he was called then. She was completely convinced that she was meant to help him claim the throne and save France.
For a young peasant girl to even think about going to the royal court, that was unheard of. But Joan believed that her mission came directly from God, and that gave her the courage to defy all expectations.
So she goes to Vaucouleurs to meet Robert de Baudricourt. He was the local military commander, and he completely dismisses her. Can you imagine that? A peasant girl saying she has divine visions and wants to lead an army? He probably thought she was delusional.
I can see that.
But Joan was persistent. She went back to Baudricourt not just once, but twice. And each time she gained a little bit more support, until even he couldn't ignore her determination anymore. He must have seen something in her eyes, this fire, a conviction that couldn't be denied. And that's when she sets off on this dangerous journey through enemy territory to reach Chinon, where Charles VII's court was located.
And this is where we get this detail that would later become a big point of contention. Joan decided to travel dressed in men's clothing.
That was pretty daring.
Absolutely.
Some historians think it was purely practical, for safety and easier travel. But others see it as her challenging the norms, like a symbolic representation of the role she was taking on.
It's a great example of how all these different interpretations can add layers to Joan's story. What stands out to you about this decision?
I think it shows how fearless she was and her willingness to break the mold. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about that meeting with Charles VII. She arrives at Chinon, this young woman, ready to tell the future king of France that God sent her to help him.
That meeting at Chinon is shrouded in so much mystery. We have these conflicting accounts and interpretations. But what we do know is that Joan made a strong impression on Charles. I mean, think about it. This young, unknown woman claiming divine guidance, standing in front of the man who holds the fate of France in his hands.
And she wasn't just there asking for his help. She was declaring that she was divinely appointed to lead him to victory.
And remarkably, Charles was convinced. They had this private conversation. The details are still debated by historians, but some accounts claim that Joan revealed secret knowledge to him, things that confirmed his legitimacy as the true heir.
That's incredible, but of course Charles couldn't just take her word for it. There were skeptics in the court, people who needed more, so what did they do?
They put Joan through a series of tests. To prove or disprove her claims, theologians were brought in, these experts in religious matters, to examine her. Imagine the pressure. They asked her about everything: her visions, her faith, her motives, trying to figure out if she was really divinely inspired or just a clever fraud.
I bet they threw every theological question they could think of at her.
Oh, yeah. And she stood her ground, didn't waver in her conviction. She insisted that her mission came straight from God, even under such intense scrutiny.
That takes some serious courage. But the tests didn't stop there. Remember those prophecies about a virgin savior?
Right.
Well, they also made Joan undergo a physical examination to confirm her virginity.
That was seen as crucial evidence
Yeah,
to support her claims. But it really makes you think about the historical context.
it really does. It's amazing to think about the level of scrutiny she faced. But she passed every single test, impressing everyone with her piety and her sincerity. And that's when the stage was set for Joan's transformation.
From a peasant girl, a warrior, Charles was now totally convinced of her divine calling, and he decided to give her everything she needed. This young woman, who had spent her life tending sheep and spinning wool, was now being fitted for armor and given command of an army.
That's quite an image, Joan. This peasant girl, now clad in shining armor, ready to lead men into battle.
And it gets even more interesting. She actually designed her own banner to symbolize her unique role, and she requested a specific sword, one that was said to be buried beneath the altar of a church in Saint-Catherine-de-Fierbois.
Okay.
And this wasn't just any sword, it was full of symbolism, connecting her to warriors of the past, reinforcing her image as a leader chosen by God.
It's like something out of a legend.
It really is.
But this is where things get real. Joan sets off for Orléans, a city under siege by the English. The French were losing, morale was shattered, and the fate of France hung in the balance.
And then, into this desperate situation, rides Joan of Arc.
It's almost like a scene out of a movie. The English had been pounding Orléans for months, but then Joan shows up and it was like this wave of energy swept through the entire French army.
Oh, her presence was electric. Here was this young woman, radiating confidence and determination, banner held high, proclaiming that God was on their side.
But it wasn't all just for show. Joan actually got involved in the fighting, leading charges,
Right.
rallying the troops. She even got wounded in the process.
She was fearless. And the French soldiers were so inspired by her courage and her conviction. They fought with this renewed vigor.
It's amazing to think that just 9 days after she arrived, the English, who had seemed unstoppable, they retreated. The siege of Orléans was broken.
Yeah, it had been dragging on for months.
Yeah.
And Joan just comes in and changes everything.
It was a turning point in the war, not just strategically, but psychologically. It was like Joan single-handedly shifted the entire momentum of the war.
Absolutely. And she knew this was just the beginning. She wanted Charles to keep pushing, to launch a campaign and reclaim the Loire Valley and secure his way to Reims for his coronation.
Reims was the traditional spot for French coronations, so being crowned there would make Charles's claim to the throne much stronger in the eyes of the people, and just as importantly, the nobility.
Right. It was a smart move on Joan's part. She really understood the importance of symbolism and tradition.
So that's when the Loire campaign begins.
Yep.
And what follows is a series of quick victories for the French. It's amazing how fast the tide had turned.
It really is.
It's like Joan had this special ability to predict what the enemy was going to do and inspire her troops to do incredible things. One of the most decisive battles of this whole campaign was the Battle of Pétain. The French forces, led by Joan, completely destroyed the English army.
Pétain was a huge blow to the English. Their morale was crushed, and their grip on the Loire Valley was significantly weakened. It cleared the way for Charles to advance to Reims.
And just a few weeks later, on July 17th, 1429, Charles VII is crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. Just as Joan had predicted, can you picture her standing there, witnessing her mission coming true, the peasant girl who helped a king get crowned?
It's a moment of pure triumph, like something straight out of a fairy tale. But unfortunately for Joan, this victory also marked the beginning of her downfall.
It's like a Shakespearean tragedy. You go from this amazing high to...
A rapid and tragic fall. You see, even with Charles as king, the war wasn't over. The English were still a threat. And some people in the French court started to see Joan as a problem.
You mean after all she had done for them?
I know, it's hard to believe. But yes, some people thought her belief in military action and divine guidance was getting in the way of a peaceful resolution. They wanted to negotiate and compromise, something that Joan, with her strong convictions, wasn't really interested in.
So while she was still fighting, her influence started to fade, and then there was that failed attempt to capture Paris. That really hurt her reputation. And made her critics even louder.
Yeah, that setback. And the changing political scene. It all created a dangerous situation for Joan. People started whispering that maybe her visions weren't from God after all. Maybe she was just really good at manipulating people. Or even worse, a heretic.
It's so sad that after everything she did for France, her own people started to turn against her. And then in 1430, during a battle at Compiègne, disaster struck. Joan was captured by Burgundian forces, who were allied with the English.
That was a crushing blow to the French. And a propaganda victory for the English. The Maid of Orléans, this symbol of French resistance, was now a prisoner of war.
It's heartbreaking to think that Charles VII, the king she helped put on the throne, didn't even try to ransom her. Why do you think that was?
Well, there are a lot of theories. Some say Charles was pressured by people in his court who saw Joan as a threat. Others think that he just didn't want to risk another conflict with the English, whatever the reason. Joan, the woman who had risked everything for him, was abandoned.
And to make things even worse, the Burgundians sold her to the English.
The English knew how powerful Joan was, not just as a military leader, but as a symbol. They couldn't let her be a rallying point for the French, so they came up with a plan to silence her, to discredit her, and ultimately to destroy her.
And that plan involved a trial, but not a fair one. It was a show trial to condemn Joan for heresy.
They accused her of witchcraft, blasphemy, and of course they used her cross-dressing as proof that she was defying God.
It was also manipulative. They were determined to break her, to force her to say her visions were fake and admit she was a fraud.
And they put her through a horrible ordeal. No lawyer, constant questioning, threats of torture. But even in captivity, Joan's spirit didn't break.
It's amazing she showed such incredible courage and wit, challenging her accusers with clever answers and unwavering faith.
There's this famous part of the trial where they asked her if she knew if she was in God's grace. It was a total trap. If she said yes, they'd see she was claiming to know God's will. If she said no, they'd condemn her for not having faith.
So what did she say?
She gave a brilliant answer. She said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me."
Wow, that was quick thinking. And she had such deep faith. But sadly, none of it mattered. The trial was rigged from the beginning. They found her guilty and sentenced her to death.
On May 30th, 1431, at just 19 years old, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen, France. It's a truly tragic ending to her story.
It's hard to believe that the woman who saved France was betrayed and killed by the people she fought to protect. It's a reminder of how complex history can be, how power can be so fickle, and how strong the human spirit can be.
A story that sticks with you even after all this time, huh?
It really is. It's hard to believe that just one person, especially a young woman from such a small village, could have such a huge impact on history.
And yet here we are, still talking about her all these centuries later, still debating her motives, her visions, what it all meant. It just shows you the power of her story.
So what happened after she died? Did the English end up winning the war?
They did not. The war kept going for another 20 years. But eventually the French won. Inspired in part by Joan's memory, Charles VII stayed king, and the English were driven out.
It's like even though she was gone, Joan's spirit lived on in the French people.
I like that. And even though she was called a heretic, people never stopped believing in her. In fact, just a few years after the war ended, people started trying to clear her name.
Really? So soon after her execution? That's surprising.
It really is. It shows you how powerful her story was and how much doubt there was about her trial. An initial inquest was done in 1450, and they found all sorts of problems with the way the trial was conducted. And then in 1455, a formal rehabilitation trial was opened.
So they basically put her trial on trial.
Exactly. Witnesses testified, evidence was looked at again. And the court decided that the original trial was completely unfair. Joan's condemnation was officially overturned.
Wow. It's like they were trying to fix a horrible mistake, even though it was too late to save her.
Yeah. It's a powerful message. They acknowledged that Joan was wrongly convicted, and they reaffirmed her place as a hero of France. But it didn't stop there. Centuries later, in 1920, Joan of Arc was made a saint by the Catholic Church.
You're kidding. From heretic to saint? That's an amazing journey.
It is. It speaks to how enduring her story is, and how her image has been used and interpreted throughout history. She's a symbol of French patriotism, religious devotion, and even female empowerment.
It makes sense that so many different people connect with her. Her story has everything: faith, courage, perseverance, standing up for what you believe in, even when everyone's against you.
Right. And for a lot of women, Joan's story is especially inspiring. She broke all the rules, showed that women could be leaders, warriors, and agents of change.
She really was an extraordinary person.
She was. And her story makes us think. It makes us question things about faith, about history, and about how much impact one person can have.
So where does that leave us? What can we learn from Joan of Arc?
I think it teaches us that even in the darkest times, hope can come from unexpected places. It reminds us that anyone, no matter where they come from, can change the course of history. And it shows us that truth and justice, even if they're delayed, will eventually win out.
Those are important lessons. This has been an amazing deep dive into Joan of Arc's life.
Right.
And it makes me wonder, what if she hadn't died so young? How would things have been different? What else could she have achieved?
Those are great questions. And they're questions that historians are still thinking about. Maybe Joan, with her strong faith and her brilliant military mind, could have ended the Hundred Years' War earlier. Maybe she would have become a powerful political leader and changed France forever. Or maybe she would have chosen a quieter life and focused on her spirituality. We can only imagine.
One thing's for sure, her story is still inspiring people hundreds of years later.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that there's always more to learn about Joan of Arc, this incredible woman who defied expectations and left her mark on the world.
Well said. And to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring Joan of Arc's life. There's so much out there to discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into history.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.